In the heart of history lies the story of an empire so vast, so powerful, that for more than 6 centuries, it ruled lands stretching from the gates of Vienna in Europe, to the deserts of Arabia, from the shores of North Africa, to the mountains of Persia. This was no ordinary kingdom. This was the Ottoman Empire. An empire that rose from the ashes of small Turkish tribes, defeated mighty powers, shook the Christian world with fear, and at its height, commanded respect, wealth, and glory. But as history teaches us, no empire lasts forever. The story of the Ottoman Empire is not just about conquest and power. It is also about corruption, betrayal, weakness, and the failure to adapt to changing times. It is a story of great men and poor decisions, of faith and politics, of glory and downfall. And in its final chapters, it is a story of how, after 600 years, the empire that once seemed invincible, collapsed into dust. This is the story of the fall of the Ottoman Empire.
Our story begins in the late 13th century, in the rugged mountains of Anatolia, see modern-day Turkey. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, once dominant in the region, was in decline after the devastating Mongol invasions. Anatolia was divided into small, semi-independent principalities called Beyliks. Among these many Beyliks, one was ruled by a small Turkish chief named Osman I. Osman was not a king. He was not even the most powerful of the Beys, but he had three things that set him apart: ambition, military skill, and vision. The lands of his Beylik bordered the weakened Byzantine Empire, and Osman realized, where others see weakness, I see opportunity. By raiding Byzantine territories and slowly conquering small towns, Osman expanded his power. His followers were not just Turks, they were warriors of different tribes, united under one idea: the spread of Islam, and the promise of riches through conquest. When Osman died in 1324, his son Orhan took over. Orhan captured Bursa, a rich Byzantine city, and made it the capital. Bursa became the first jewel of the Ottoman crown. It was from this small beginning that the empire would rise. The Ottomans soon developed a military system unlike any other in the region. They created the famous Janissary Corps, an elite army made up not of Turks, but of young Christian boys taken from the Balkans, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be loyal soldiers of the Sultan. This system, known as the Devshirme, produced some of the most disciplined troops in the world. The Janissaries feared no one. They became the sword and shield of the empire. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans had crossed into Europe. They captured Gallipoli and began spreading across the Balkans. While Europe was divided, fighting endless wars among themselves, the Ottomans kept advancing. In 1453, under the leadership of Mehmed Iic, later called Mehmed the Conqueror, the Ottomans achieved their greatest early victory, the capture of Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire, protected by massive walls that had withstood every attack. But Mehmed was determined. With massive cannons, relentless assaults, and brilliant strategy, the Ottomans finally broke through. The city that was once the heart of the Christian Byzantine world became the new capital of the Islamic Ottoman Empire. It was renamed Istanbul. This victory shocked the Christian world. It marked the true beginning of the Ottoman Golden Age. After the fall of Constantinople, the Ottomans expanded rapidly. They took over Greece, Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and much of Eastern Europe. In the east, they clashed with Persians. In the south, they pushed into Syria, Egypt, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. By the early 16th century, under rulers like Selim I and Suleiman the Magnificent, The Ottoman Empire had become the most powerful state in the world. Suleiman expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, sea from Hungary in the west to Iraq in the east, from Yemen in the south to Algeria in North Africa. The empire was not just powerful militarily. It was also a center of trade, art, and culture. Istanbul became a city of magnificent mosques, bustling markets, and scholars from all over the world. The Ottomans controlled the key trade routes between Europe and Asia. Spices, silk, and treasures flowed through their lands, making them incredibly wealthy. It seemed that nothing could stop the empire's rise. But as we will soon see, the seeds of decline were already being planted. History is filled with empires that seemed invincible, yet collapsed. The Ottomans were no different. While their armies marched across continents, internal problems began to grow. Corruption seeped into the administration. The Janissaries, once the most elite troops, became greedy and resisted change. And Europe, once weak and divided, began to rise with new ideas, new technologies, and new ambitions. The stage was set for a clash between tradition and modernization, between East and West, between the old and the new world. The Ottoman Empire had reached its peak, and as history always reminds us, after the peak comes the decline. The death of Suleiman the Magnificent in 1566 marked the end of the empire's true golden era. Suleiman was a warrior, a lawmaker, and a visionary. Under his leadership, the Ottomans had conquered vast lands stretching from Hungary to Arabia, from North Africa to the gates of Vienna. But his successors, they lacked his strength and wisdom. The new sultans became more like figureheads, relying heavily on advisors, concubines, and court officials. This trend of weak leadership would plague the empire for centuries. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, something extraordinary and dangerous happened. The empire saw a period known as the Sultanate of Women, because many of the later sultans ascended the throne as young boys. The real power often fell into the hands of their mothers and the harem. Women like Ks.em Sultan and Hr.em Sultan held enormous influence, while some were skilled politicians. This system opened the door to court intrigues, assassinations, and corruption. The empire that once struck fear into Europe now fought its battles in palace corridors rather than on the battlefield. Originally, the Janissaries were the empire's most disciplined military force. They were the backbone of Ottoman military strength, feared across Europe. But over time, they became arrogant, refusing modernization and demanding privileges. They revolted often, killing reformist sultans and ministers. By the 18th century, the Janissaries were more interested in politics and business than warfare. When European armies adopted modern firearms and training, the Janissaries resisted change. This left the empire technologically backward compared to rising powers like Austria, Russia, and later Britain and France. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire controlled key trade routes between Asia and Europe. This brought wealth and prestige. But when European explorers discovered sea routes to India and the Americas, global trade shifted away from Ottoman-controlled territories. While European nations grew rich from overseas colonies, the Ottomans clung to old systems. Their economy weakened, tax collection became corrupt, and inflation soared. As gold and silver poured into Europe, the Ottoman coffers began to run dry. And with empty treasuries came new troubles: internal revolts, unpaid soldiers, and political chaos. From the late 18th century onwards, the empire's non-Turkish subjects, Greeks, Serbs, Arabs, Armenians, began demanding independence. Inspired by the French Revolution and fueled by European powers, nationalist uprisings shook the empire. The first major blow came with the Greek War of Independence, 1821 c. 1829. Despite brutal suppression attempts, Greece gained independence, signaling the start of Ottoman disintegration in Europe. In the 19th century, Ottoman leaders realized the empire needed change. This led to the Tanzimat reforms 1839 c. 1876. Which aimed to modernize the military, administration, and legal system. But these reforms faced resistance from conservatives, the Janissaries, and even common people who saw them as threats to Islamic traditions. The empire was caught between tradition and modernization, and in the end, it achieved neither. By the mid-19th century, European powers began calling the Ottomans the sick man of Europe. Why? Because the empire was too weak to defend itself, too important to be allowed to collapse entirely. This led to a century of European interference in Ottoman affairs. Russia wanted control of the Black Sea. Britain and France wanted Ottoman territories to prevent Russian expansion. The empire became a pawn in the great game of European politics. The mighty empire that had once stood unchallenged was now bleeding from within. Corruption, economic ruin, and nationalist fires burned its foundations. But the worst was yet to come. A devastating war that would bring the final curtain down on 600 years of Ottoman rule.
The Ottoman Empire. Once a superpower spanning 3 continents. From the palaces of Istanbul to the deserts of Arabia, its influence shaped the course of history. But by the early 20th century, the empire was gasping for air, surrounded by enemies and betrayed from within. This is the final chapter in the story of a dynasty that ruled for over 600 years, and how it came to an end. Our story begins in 1918. The First World War had just ended. For the Ottoman Empire, it was a disaster. Allied forces, Britain, France, Italy, and Greece, were already dividing Ottoman lands like a cake at a banquet. Arab territories were gone. Istanbul, the heart of the empire, was under Allied occupation. And sitting on the throne was Sultan Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman Sultan. Mehmed VI was a man burdened with history. He wanted to save the empire, but he was trapped. The Allies imposed the harsh Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, stripping away almost everything. The empire was reduced to a small region in Anatolia. The dream of Ottoman glory was shattered. But while the Sultan accepted defeat, one man refused. His name was Mustafa Kemal, a former Ottoman officer, brilliant, fearless, and determined. While Istanbul bowed to the Allies, Mustafa Kemal traveled to Anatolia. There, he started a movement that would change history, the Turkish War of Independence. In 1919, Kemal gathered nationalists, soldiers, and ordinary citizens who believed in a free homeland. The struggle wasn't just against foreign powers, it was also against the Ottoman Sultan, who was seen as a puppet of the Allies. The empire was breaking apart from the inside. The Allies, overconfident, allowed Greece to invade western Anatolia. They believed the Turks would surrender. But Mustafa Kemal organized a fierce resistance. From 1919 to 1922, the Turkish national movement fought back. The battles were brutal. Towns were destroyed. Thousands died. But slowly, the tide turned. In 1922, the nationalists crushed the Greek army at the Battle of Dumlupanar. The victory was decisive. The dream of carving Anatolia into pieces was over. For the first time in years, the Turkish people saw hope. But what about the Sultan? The Allies were losing control, and the nationalist movement was unstoppable. On November 1, 1922, the Grand National Assembly abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. 6 centuries of Ottoman rule ended with a single vote. Mehmed VI realized it was over. On the night of November 17, 1922, he fled Istanbul aboard a British warship, leaving behind a palace that once commanded the world. He would die in exile, far from the city of his ancestors. With the Sultan gone, Mustafa Kemal pushed forward. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne recognized the sovereignty of the new Republic of Turkey. The Ottoman Empire was officially dead. Mustafa Kemal, now known as Ataturk, father of the Turks, became the first president of Turkey. Ataturk began radical reforms, abolishing the caliphate, introducing secular laws, changing the alphabet, and modernizing the nation. For some, it was liberation. For others, it felt like betrayal of Ottoman traditions. But one thing was clear, the age of sultans was over. Historians debate the reasons for the empire's collapse. Corruption, weak leadership, and economic decline played their part. The empire failed to keep up with modern technology and industry. Internal revolts, European imperialism, and the disaster of World War I sealed its fate. But perhaps the greatest lesson of the Ottoman story is this: no empire, no matter how mighty, lasts forever. Power fades, borders change, and history moves on. Yet, the legacy of the Ottomans remains. In architecture, in law, in language, and in the hearts of millions who still remember an empire that once united cultures and continents. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was not just the end of a dynasty, it was the dawn of a new era. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you want more stories like this, full of drama, power, and lessons from the past, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.